In the end, we will remember not the words of our enemies, but the silence of our friends. Don't worry, I haven't forgotten the words. I wanted to illustrate the power of silence. It can make us think. It can make us feel awkward. And every so often, after somebody has said a joke that hasn't quite landed, perhaps a home truth, or somebody says, I love you for the first time to their partner, silence can hurt. As difficult as those situations are, I believe when Martin Luther King stepped on stage in the autumn of 1967 and uttered those immortal words, in the end, we'll remember not the words of our enemies, but the silence of our friends. He had a more profound concern. To understand what he may have been speaking to, it's important to look at the context. It's 1967, and Martin Luther King has been announced as giving the prestigious Macy Lecture, a series of talks titled Conscious for Change. The audience is not just the people in the Ebenezer Baptist Church. No. It goes much further. And it's speaking to the Canadian Broadcasting Channel. See, that might suggest that it was a reproach to Canadians. Indeed, when this quote is often referred to more widely, it's often pointed to somebody who may not have spoken up, or spoken up too late. But if we look a little bit deeper, we will see that the Canadians had a special place in the heart of the civil rights movement and the anti-slavery movement before that. Martin Luther King described them as a North Star, a place of opportunity for enslaved people, a place that offered liberty from servitude, freedom from fear, and dignity of education. So perhaps the quote is actually a rallying call, an opportunity for us to search within, to see how we're speaking up, to see when we're stepping in for friends and allies. So that's it, all solved. We can leave here knowing that we've addressed it, ready to speak up and speak out. And this is probably the shortest ever TEDx talk you've ever been to. Just one issue. It's not that easy. Because it often comes at great sacrifice and at personal cost. You see, one of my first experiences of this was in primary school. We had all decided to get into a class fight. Indeed, I had no reason to be involved in this class fight. I didn't know what the class fight was about. But a friend said to me that we were having a class fight, so I lined up with fellow classmates. This was no ordinary class fight because each child was matched up with a child of a similar size, almost reminiscent of a weight class. The challenge was, I was a late bloomer. So I was less of a heavyweight, no. I was more of a super featherweight. And it took a few moments to be paired up with someone of a similar size. When I was paired up, the boy I was paired up with had a look in his eye like he was willing and ready for the duel. He yelled something out from across the playground. I couldn't quite make it out, but I was in no mood to ask him to repeat it. Standing there in my green little t-shirt, the heart pounding, sweat dripping down my hands, unable to clench my non-existent fist, it was at that moment I asked myself, why did I come out that playtime? You see, that's often the difficulty and the challenge, because when we do want to speak up, we identify the cost to us, the fear, whether our tiny frames are able to make a difference. The Neuro Leadership Institute put it best when they spoke about speaking up continuum. It talked about 3 types of speaking up. Firstly, it talked about sharing one's ideas. Secondly, it talked about questioning others' ideas. But the most challenging was both criticizing and challenging others' behaviors, because it caused the greatest social threat to one's status. In the end, we'll remember not the words of our enemies, but the silence of our friends. as studies and history has shown us, if we do speak up, we see those unlikely alliances and we unlock those partnerships. My first experience of this was the summer of 2020 and following the death of George Floyd, which sparked the Black Lives Matter protests right across the world. I was a councillor in Southwark, South London, and I was tasked with leading the response to the issues raised. Systemic racism, injustice within the police force, and wider inequality. As part of our work, we led a series of roundtable events and open events as well. In one of those events, a 14-year-old black girl at the end asked for our advice as to how to break the glass ceiling. A question so profound. I reflected on it for some moments. How as a society had we failed so that a 14-year-old was already clear there was a limit on her ambition? After some days, I relayed that conversation on to a similar event. And afterwards, a middle-aged white woman, probably lived in one of the most affluent parts of the borough, approached me and said that she would like to stand with the campaign. And she was equally disgusted as well. You see, all throughout that summer, people from different races, ages, backgrounds and sexuality said that Southwark Council's fight against inequality was their fight. It's why when we named it Southwark Stands Together, it spoke to those unlikely alliances that were developed. And indeed, throughout history, we've seen that human prosperity has been as the result of unlikely alliances, people coming together to fight against injustice. It's what meant the unlikely alliance of the National Lawyers Guild and also students from the Non-Violent Committee fighting against the Jim Crow laws in the South as part of the civil rights movement. It's what inspired young gay and lesbian activists to fundraise and stand up for minors in South Wales in the 1980s. The campaign we chose, Southwark Stands Together, was preceded by the borough's coat of arms, United to Serve. And it's why Alex Scott, Ian Wright, and Alan Shearer stood with their friend Gary Lineker, who was reported to be taken off air because of a tweet. In the end, we will remember not the words of our enemies, but the silence of our friends. You see, Martin Luther King's rallying call is just as important today as it was back then. See, like then, today the issue is not one of intention, it's speaking out at moments of great injustice. The Waits Group did a study of allyship, and what they found, speaking to 5,000 employees, was that whilst most people wanted to stand up at great moments of injustice, only a third of respondents had said that they had spoken up in support of a colleague at a time of great injustice, despite 67% of people saying they identified with someone from a different background. When we think about the great injustices of the 21st century, whether it be widening inequality between the richest and the poorest, a climate crisis which is not just threatening our livelihood but our very existence, and the age-old issue that means if you're a woman from an LGBTQ+ community, a person of colour, or a person with a disability, far too often you know what it feels like to be discriminated against. These issues are not going to be solved by one voice alone, or one community. They never have. It requires unlikely alliances, people speaking up against great injustices. In the end, we'll remember not the words of our enemies, but the silence of our friends. You see, in many ways, we're in our own version of a playground, working out whether we can make a difference, whether our tiny frame will be able to stand up to the test. And here's my response. We may be asking ourselves whether this is our fight. I say it is. We may be asking ourselves whether we'll be alone in speaking out. I say we won't. And we may be asking ourselves whether we can actually make a difference. I say we can. I am under no illusions that it's people coming together, standing up, making unlikely alliances that will be at the vanguard of making progress and challenging injustice in the years to come. More than ever, each of us in this room, and more widely, can make a difference. But we can no longer afford to be the silent friend. Thank you.